So why do people get drawn towards negative emotions? I find this myself. I'll read 100 comments in my comment section that are saying really positive things. Great interview, Clyde. Fantastic work you've done. And then you get one guy that writes something awful, and you just dwell on it. You dwell on it for the whole day. You'll think about it, and everything else. Hundreds of comments in the other way won't help.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, because I had that problem, which I managed to resolve. Because what it is, a lot of it comes from our conditioning, and in fact, in another podcast, we can get onto that because it's incredible. So, I said to someone a few months ago that the questions that I had intended to answer, I went on a journey about 25 years ago studying this. I got my answers a couple of months ago. So, since then, I've been able to change the things about my behavior that I wasn't able to previously, and I tried and failed. And it's understanding how your unconscious mind's working. Rewards and punishments were a big part of it, because what's going on is that you generally move towards what feels good and away from what feels bad. Okay, that's a general of all organisms on this planet. Move towards pleasure, away from pain, and that's generally a good survival mechanism. Yeah, because
but we do the opposite. We do the absolute opposite in this case.
Well, but reasons are because if you mistake a branch for a snake, okay, that's fine, you survive. But if you mistake a snake for a branch, you don't. Okay, so in fact, the brain's wired for caution. The brain's wired to spot the negative in situations. A lot of it's to do with the environment. But what will happen is that, and this is where it gets really very fascinating, but what you've got is evolutionary terms. Emotions provide very important messages. Now, one of the messages, well, fear is basically survival and protection. So, fear is a threat to survival. Now, but people fear criticism. Okay, but criticism isn't a threat to survival, is it?
No, it's not at all.
But it shouldn't be. But it actually has been coded as that way. So what happens is, advertising looks to create an association between two things. Okay, their product and positive emotion, or negative emotion if it's to sell a burglar alarm or whatever it is. But so basically, the carrots and sticks are generally to provide a reward or relieve a pressure. Okay, that's generally it. To move away from the pain or to move towards the pleasure. And moving towards the pleasure is getting a reward. Moving away from pain is to get the relief of that thing. And the relief of that thing is really very powerful. So that's where the animal training is, to apply some pressure and then relieve it when the animal does as it's told. And that's what a lot of the COVID policies were.
Right.
So what happens with the conditioning, which is really, really key, is that if parents give children feedback in a loving way, they don't develop a fear to criticism. But if the feedback is delivered in a way where because what's going on in the child, which the studies suggest this is what goes on, it's quite well researched, is that if your parents criticize you, you're worried that they're going to abandon you, which is a threat to survival. If you lose your caregivers, it's a threat to survival. So what happens is, so think about it, people aren't born with spider phobias, okay? They develop them from experience. So what happens is the fear and the spider fuse together. Okay, so they see the spider and the fear happens automatically. You don't see the distinction between them. The same thing happens with criticism and fear. Okay. Now that, in fact, we could do that if you want at some point. I could show you how to decondition those things, because when you don't give a shit about the negative comments, because objectively.
I'd like to be there one day. That'd be great.
Yeah. Well, it's relatively straightforward. But objectively, if you get 99% of positive comments, okay, that's fine. I mean, if you get 80%, in fact, generally, it's very hard to get above 80% of any kind of percentage-wise in approval. Now, if you're trying to please everyone, you end up pleasing no one.
That's right. Yeah,
a lot of the case. So objectively, but here's a real great example. But you can't decide on your response because it's fired off unconsciously, isn't it?
Mhm.
Okay. And it's fired off unconsciously because something in the unconscious mind, in the engine room of the mind, is because what it's let's theorize that in your position, if you see a negative comment and you have criticism equals threat to survival, then that comment represents a threat to your survival, even though it doesn't. You know, logically it doesn't, but it will create the emotion as though it does.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like logically, I look at it and go,
Yeah.
like you have to be rude. Okay, whatever.
Yeah.
Move on. But
Yeah.
I just seem to remember that one instead of all the other positive
Exactly.
ones. It's just like
Because your brain, if you're
that hangs.
because in your brain, if it's got criticism equals a threat to survival, then your brain's going to go, well, you need to know about this dude because it's a threat to your survival. So the wiring
Right.
is so important. Do you see how? So if they can condition people to think that wearing a mask protects them from a danger that they've conditioned someone to think the danger is very severe and real, it's all to do with the wiring. Logic doesn't come into it that much because we've all tried to reason with someone reacting emotionally and it's pointless. Because this is where one of the podcasts, actually, we could get onto this because it's really fascinating, but the conditioning is the key. Because effectively they will condition things and then they can predict a response because of the conditioning. So one of the earliest and most unethical studies was that they created a rat phobia in a child that was called Little Albert. And what they did was they just made a very loud noise when the rat was present. And then the child developed a phobia of rats. So they're able actually to create. So that's really what happened with COVID. They were giving people a like phobia response to COVID. Yeah. And it didn't make any logical sense because people were much more scared of COVID than they were things that would have a very real threat to them.
Right. Now, I remember some of the propaganda in the early days. They were showing videos of people
Yeah.
collapsing
Yeah.
just spontaneously.
Yeah.
Mass body bags in
Yeah.
China, that kind of stuff. That all disappeared off the internet, incidentally. Like it's all
Yeah.
gone.
Well, that's actually really key because what's going on is so there's a thing called the primacy effect, and it's different from priming. What it says is that the first piece of information you're exposed to, like first impressions count. So the
Right.
first piece of information is actually forms the foundation of your knowledge in your mind. So if you imagine that you're trying to work out if something's dangerous or not, okay? So you're going into a campsite in your mind. It's like, where do I plant this tent? Do I plant it in the this is very mild risk, or do I plant it in the this is a very dangerous risk? And of course, once you see people dropping dead in the street, it goes in the very dangerous risk. So basically, the whole initial things is people are like classifying this is not just if people think this is similar to flu, they know how to deal with that. But what they did was, and they manipulated a part of the brain called the reticular activating system, which is effectively the part of the brain that filters reality for us. So they kept using the word novel and new because anything that's novel and new gets highlighted by the reticular activating system. Makes sense? If everyone said this is similar to flu, it wouldn't have done that. Everyone knows how to deal with that.
Right.
And that's why I think the 2009, because it's well documented that there was a faked pandemic in 2009, the swine flu. Okay, they even ran documentaries on it where they said the WHO, I think it was WHO, tried to fake a pandemic. Okay, but it didn't work. Okay, largely because a German doctor destroyed the whole narrative of that, and the whole thing collapsed. But
No way.
you look into the history of that; it's very fascinating. It almost mirrored what happened, but basically the second time round,
Everybody bought it.
the learnings from the first time. In fact, because 2010 is when the BIT teams began. Okay, the behavioral insights team are the guys behind that Mindspace document. So in 2009, they didn't have the level of sophistication in propaganda, influence, and knowledge of how the mind works to what they did in 2020. So the ability to manipulate people went through, it was like propaganda on steroids.
Wow.
Okay, and you start to see. So the operant conditioning, which is really, I always try to use the layman's terms because a lot of the time they create these complex terms, I think, to sound more clever than they are a lot of the time. But basically, the operating condition is just understanding how incentives or how rewards and punishments affect behavior.
Okay.
And it's so key, because we look in the Wells Fargo that you create what is known as a mixed signal, where you say people be honest, but you create the reward to not be honest, and you're going to see people not be honest. So the mixed signal is very key, because you see it everywhere, and this is when you get the double speak, you know, all the time, where they pretend, because really all they're doing is they're just trying to look good as they, you know, do something dishonest.
Thanks for tuning in. This is actually a smaller clip from a larger conversation that took place on the channel. If you want to check that out, the link will be in the description down below. We'll see you in the next one. Keep on trucking.